My friends, historically speaking, playing the War of Attrition card on Russia is not the best move. Every time you play this card, somehow the Russians end up in your capital.
A few moments later.
Berlin. Побежден.
The mainstream media is giving the impression that Ukraine is actually winning this war of attrition, and that at any moment the Russian military will collapse. Russia's vast stocks of Soviet-era weaponry are running out. Russia's narrowing advantage in Ukraine. Satellite data suggests Russia may be running out of tanks. Putin's nightmare is Russia running out of troops for Ukraine war.
Madness. Madness and stupidity.
Meanwhile, Ukraine's commander-in-chief claims Russia doubled the number of tanks and armored vehicles, tripled the amount of artillery. So who's right? Meanwhile, the German-based Kiel Institute for the World Economy published a report on the 9th of September, warning that Russia has significantly increased its defense industrial base. The biggest joke in this war of attrition is how Ukraine claims to inflict 7 times more casualties on the enemy, yet Russia benefits from a 10-to-1 advantage in firepower. According to the main narrative, the Russian army is at its worst, yet it captured the most territory in Donbass ever, and at an accelerated pace. This was the situation on the 1st of January 2024, and this is the situation now 9 months later. Ukraine simply doesn't seem to know how to handle this massive expanding Russian bulge. That's the reality. And it's not as if this entire withdrawal is controlled. Entire units of our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia are on the verge of collapse. And it's not me saying it, it's the troops on the ground. Here from the Washington Post, Ukraine is bleeding out. Ukraine's new infantry recruits freeze in face of Russian onslaught. The Ukrainian infantry is most accurately affected. Its troops are grappling with exhaustion and flagging morale, leading some to abandon their positions. French media outlet Le Monde corroborated this. Troop morale is generally low, and soldiers are disillusioned. Soldiers on the front line are extremely tired because, lacking sufficient reserves, they are sometimes unable to rotate to the rear. This is exactly what happened to the 110th Mechanized Brigade that fought in Avdiivka, and same thing for the men of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade now fighting near Vuhledar. They spent 2 years in one of the hottest parts of the front without rotation, and it's not a surprise that this sector is now falling apart. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are cashing in their combat pay while hiding away from the front. The Ukrainian army will need a miracle solution to stop the horde. That was the situation for Manpower, but now in terms of equipment, it's not better. No spoilers, the biggest problem is not ammo shortage, but Ukraine barely has artillery pieces left to fire these shells, and NATO barely has any left in storage. For example, out of 198 105mm M777 towed howitzers donated to Ukraine, 97 are confirmed as destroyed or damaged, with many of the others having been cannibalized for spare parts. And the same phenomenon can be witnessed for tanks, IFVs, MRAPs, the list goes on. So the first question is, can both Russia and Ukraine sustain this battle of attrition in terms of manpower? And the second part will be in regards to military equipment. Disclaimer, in this video will focus on the situation for the ground forces of both sides, because this is where the stakes are at the highest. Welcome to History Legends, here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian war. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. Let's start by saying that for a proper analysis, I will have to discard both Ukrainian and Russian claims of enemy casualties, since these claims will surely be highly inflated. On the broader scale, Russia knows that Ukraine's weak point is its shortage of manpower. If Russia continues to press right where it hurts, the Ukrainian army will eventually collapse. That's where you'll tell me, but what about the Russians? Yes, for sure they're taking losses, but they're also inflicting massive ones on the Ukrainians. The Russians can replace all their casualties, but the Ukrainians can't. And this is what we call the Battle of Attrition. This was the same strategy that Union General Grant notoriously employed against the Confederates in the spring of 1864 during the Overland Campaign. Unlike what we hear in the mainstream media or by many commentators, Russian forces are not using meat wave attacks. If you're interested, I debunked all this in this video. Russia is actually very careful of its manpower due to demographic problems. Russia just can't afford to lose an entire generation. According to the BBC-funded Mediazona, between January 1st and the 3rd of April 2024, Russia suffered 9,000 fatalities. If we say 2 severely injured per KIA, that's an additional 18,000 casualties, for a total of 27,000 irrecoverable losses in the first 3 months of 2024. And that was at the height of the Battle of Avdiivka. Yet we learned that during that same period, the Moscow Times reported an extra 100,000 contract soldiers for the Russian army. That means the Russian army got a net positive of 73,000 soldiers. In the following 3 months, between April and June, Russian fatalities decreased to 7,500 soldiers, while the recruitment rates stayed more or less the same. 7,500 KIA plus 15,000 severely injured, for a total of about 22,500 irrecoverable losses. This means a net positive of 77,500 troops. Overall, in the first 6 months of 2024 between January and June, Russia suffered about 50,000 irrecoverable losses. Not only did they find replacements for all their casualties, but they also grew by an extra 150,000 military personnel. At this rate, by the end of the year, the Russian armed forces would have grown by 300,000. As you can see with such numbers, Russia doesn't need to mobilize. This massive buildup of the Russian armed forces is really important, because from a strategic perspective, it allows them to pin down Ukrainian reserves all across the front, and prevent the enemy from regaining the strategic initiative. That's how Russia was able to redeploy 50 to 60,000 troops from its reserves towards Kursk Oblast. Unlike what the Ukraine command had hoped for, the Russian army did not have to halt its offensive operations in Donbass to counter the Kursk offensive. On a tactical level, this massive buildup ensures Russian assault detachments are always at full strength. And if you've seen my videos, you'll see that the Russians never allowed the Ukrainians to catch a break. Oh yeah, I almost forgot! The mainstream media needed one more attempt to talk about Russia's shortage of manpower. Check out this story from the National Interest. Russia's Admiral Kuznetsov aircraft carrier just sent its crew to fight in Ukraine. Essentially, the Russian armed forces decided to create a mechanized battalion out of the 2,000-man strong crew of the ship. Can you guess the conclusion? This move could indicate broader personnel shortages within the Russian military. One extra battalion and everybody loses their mind. Thing is, the Admiral Kuznetsov is in repair in Murmansk, near the Arctic Circle, meaning it's not going to participate in combat operations in Ukraine. And then you have thousands of sailors just sitting around. Might as well get the boys to earn their salary. It might seem shocking, but not for those who know military history. The French did the same thing during both the 1870 Franco-Prussian War and World War I. Many sailors were pulled directly from unused warships and were quickly converted into effective infantry units. Another important aspect of this war of attrition that is often overlooked is how the Russian armed forces standardized all their brigades and regiments. Unlike what the Ukrainians are doing, there are no official elite formations for the Russians. All combat units should be capable of properly carrying out their assigned combat missions, whether in attack or in defense. This also means it's much easier to assign replacements to battalions and regiments. And this is how Russia can push all across the front at the same time. On a side note, in my opinion, it's also one of the main reasons for the dismantlement of the PMC Wagner, as it concentrated all the combat experience in one corps, and prevented the rest of the Russian army from benefiting from this expertise. Mikhailo Temper, a battery commander in the 21st Battalion of Ukraine's separate presidential brigade, told the Financial Times, Putin destroyed Wagner, but he took the most effective parts of it. The Russian army learned the lessons and experiences from Wagner and are fighting like them. Now every Russian regiment and brigade has these Storm Z specialized assault detachments attached to them. And we see since then how on a tactical level the Russian army has drastically improved its offensive capabilities. Now back to the issue of manpower. We all know that each year the Russian Federation drafts 400,000 men aged 18 to 27 for military service. For sure this could also be a significant pool of manpower for the military, but for political reasons Moscow wants to avoid sending conscripts to the front, mostly due to the trauma of the Chechen wars. The Russian Ministry of Defense also doesn't want to call another partial mobilization like in 2022 due to its unpopularity. So Russian authorities preferred to increase voluntary enlistments with financial incentives. The Russian Ministry of Defense is paying every soldier around 200,000 rubles a month or 2,160 USD, about 2.4 times higher than the average salary in Russia. On top of that, they get a large one-time bonus for signing a contract with the military of nearly 800,000 rubles, almost 8,500 USD. And that's not all, every oblast adds an enlistment bonus as well.
Rich! Loved! You'll be treated by your wives and children as heroes for the rest of your lives.
I won't go too much in detail into this, but just remember that Russia pays its troops well, very well. If you're interested, I can make a video just on this topic. Another benefit is that the men that enlist in the military are motivated, perhaps motivated for cash, but they're not forcefully dragged into buses. We can also speculate that the Russian armed forces are also trying to enlist men that completed their mandatory conscription service. I mean, it's logical, these guys just went through 12 months of military training. It would be very easy to reassign them to specialized combat units. Think about it, if 20% of these young men sign contracts with the MOD, that's an extra 80,000 soldiers per year. The attrition rate in the Russian military is not solely attributed to casualties at the front. Another significant factor that is often overlooked is the expiration of short-term one-year contracts. This turnover can severely impact unit cohesion, readiness, and the overall effectiveness of the force. These one-year contracts are literally what caused so many Russian defeats in 2022. Yet they're still offering them. This is a big problem for Russia because a lot of military experience is lost just at the moment when a soldier becomes truly proficient. Now, according to SWP Berlin, the one-year period mentioned in the contract applies on paper only, and that all the kontraktniki are to remain valid until the end of the special military operation. This was the new rule since the partial mobilization of 2022. Other sources mentioned how the minimum contract is now 2 years, but once again a soldier still cannot leave unless the war is over. If that is the case, then that changes everything. We can expect the Russian ground forces to keep growing in strength, and they will soon benefit from an overwhelming numerical advantage on the Ukrainians. The second attrition is financial because their recruitment system can become very expensive, especially as enlistment bonuses keep increasing. In the end, many people talked about Russia calling a new partial mobilization in 2024. On the 11th of September, the Kyiv Independent wrote, "Putin delays new mobilization. Maybe casualties at the front are not that bad." Or more importantly, it means the solution of offering financial incentives is working. Now let's take a look at Ukraine. Here from CNN, outgunned and outnumbered, Ukraine's military is struggling with low morale and desertion. As you all know, the number of military fatalities for Ukraine is the war's biggest secret, but it's obvious that it's pretty high and that the situation is critical. Otherwise, the Washington Post would not release articles titled "Ukraine is bleeding out." For simplicity, let's just assume Ukrainian losses are the same as Russian ones, a simple 1-to-1 ratio. This means an average of about 3,000 Ukrainian soldiers KIA per month, plus 6,000 severely injured, for a total of 9,000 irrecoverable losses every 30 days. Consequently, the armed forces of Ukraine only need to find 9,000 replacements per month to stay afloat. Over a year, that represents about 108,000 replacements. But then why call for the mobilization of 500,000 men? In the best case scenario, the plan was to get enough replacements to match the attrition rate, but also replenish all existing units to full strength, and maybe even create a significant reserve force. that could possibly be used for the 2025 edition of the summer counteroffensive. In the worst case scenario, this 500,000 conscripts was only meant to be sufficient for 1 year fighting, implying that Ukrainian casualties could reach over 40,000 irrecoverable losses per month. It's not far-fetched if we take Russia's firepower advantage into consideration and the non-stop dropping of FAB bombs. Let's be honest, with FAB bombs, camping by placing claymores at every entrance becomes impossible. As an example of the attrition, in this article by CNN, a Ukrainian battalion commander quit when he learned nobody was left standing in his 800-man strong unit. Everyone in his battalion was either KIA or wounded. Can you imagine that? And let me tell you, I don't think this is unusual for the AFU. We remember this article from the Washington Post. Frontline Ukrainian infantry units report a acute shortage of soldiers. A battalion commander said, the companies in his unit on average are staffed at about 35% of what they should be. According to an article by Facti.ua, Ukraine doesn't have a standardized system that assigns replacements to combat units in need of reinforcements. This could explain a lot of the problems. This Ukrainian soldier said, there's still a lot of cunning assault brigades that can come and take your fighter straight from the training camp, thus leaving the less capable mobilized personnel for regular infantry units. The problem for Ukraine is that the motivated and patriotic men that wanted to volunteer into the military already did so in 2022. Followed by a second smaller wave in 2023. But now recruitment offices can hear crickets. Whoa, look at all these Ukrainian volunteers at the recruitment office. Nope, they're conscripts. With that being said, the Ukrainian government claims that every month they get an extra 6,000 voluntary enlistments. Press X for doubt, but even if it was true, 6,000 troops a month is not enough to replace 21,000 casualties. So they need to fill in the gaps with mobilized personnel, whose training, for the most part, is still less than a month. In reality, training is worse than you might think. Some of the Ukrainian conscripts reach the front and reportedly don't even know how to hold their rifles. At the training center, they peel more potatoes than they shoot bullets due to a shortage of ammunition. Along the front in Donetsk, 4 commanders, a deputy commander, and nearly 12 soldiers from 4 Ukrainian brigades told the Financial Times that the new conscripts lack basic combat skills, motivation, and often abandon their positions when they come under fire. I really hope they don't say this about the conscripts that were trained in Britain.
Another fuck up. Another fuck up.
Although Ukraine managed to draft about 30,000 soldiers a month since May, matching Russian numbers, the Ukrainian conscripts are being KIA at an alarming rate. There is this example of a squad of 8 men who were sent to the front as replacements. Only 2 of them had previous combat experience. The 6 others were conscripts, all over the age of 40. Within a week, all the conscripts were KIA or wounded. In the end, Ukrainian commanders estimated that 50 to 70% of new Ukrainian troops were KIA or wounded within days of starting their first rotation.
We are winning!
The only benefit for volunteers is that they get to pick the unit or branches they want to enlist in. But let's be honest, volunteers will flock to units operating at the rear like the infamous 3rd Assault Keyboard Photoshop Brigade deployed in Lviv. All this to say that nobody in Ukraine volunteers to become a frontniki. Nobody signs up to become a rifleman in a regular infantry unit sitting right on the contact line. The more motivated ones join elite combat formations. For example, I know that the 3rd Assault Brigade Azov is running its own recruitment campaign. They say don't wait for summons, volunteer. And one of the big perks is a 2-month training period. So I don't even want to know what regular conscripts have to go through. Azov is also offering 7-day boot camps for civilians to get them more familiar with the military, to reassure them, and perhaps even to get some of them to enlist. To boost their numbers, they even launched a campaign aiming to recruit 18-year-olds into their ranks. I'll be honest, Ukraine's real attrition is due to its corruption. Countless Ukrainian men bribed their way out of the draft through various fake medical exemptions or student papers. Nobody bats an eye when border guards allowed over 2 million Ukrainian males to flee abroad. Apparently, prices to help crossing the border have risen to as much as $10,000. And if you're caught, no big deal. You can be released after paying another bribe. Now, in regards to the Ukrainian men that fled abroad, on an individual level, they're doing the right decision. But all this has also consequences on the front line. I spoke to some foreign fighters and AFU soldiers that are actually fighting at the front right now, and they're pissed at the men that fled abroad. They want to strip them of Ukrainian citizenship and seize all their assets in Ukraine if they don't immediately come back. A Ukrainian soldier told The Guardian about his disappointment when hearing stories of men hiding or attempting to flee the country. He said, "I understand that people are scared, but we simply need new recruits to keep fighting." Low-key, the military should have placed Azov in charge of the border and instead created Border Guard Storm Brigade. But I'm not sure if they'll be really that efficient on the front because their pockets are so full of cash that it might interfere with their movements. Jokes aside, so that's one of the problems, but there's another one. An open secret, let's say. Many Ukrainian military personnel bribe their way out of frontline positions. One Ukrainian journalist was surprised by the amount of expert desktop positions that were popping up in the last months around Kyiv. Others receive their military papers, go through training, and then go home. Or if they go to the front and they're wounded, they go to the hospital and never come back. They just go home as well. Others just chill at some random checkpoints across the country far from the front, all the while cashing their combat pay. Long story short, it's so unorganized. So in theory, the armed forces of Ukraine have a lot of troops. Some report 1 million, but in reality only a fraction are actually doing the fighting in the trenches. This explains how rifle units are constantly under strength. Here from CNN, desertion and insubordination are becoming a widespread problem, especially among newly recruited soldiers. In the first 4 months of 2024, prosecutors launched criminal proceedings against almost 19,000 soldiers who either abandoned their posts or deserted. Meanwhile, sources on the ground said the phenomenon is widespread and those are the only guys that got caught. Equipment attrition. Manpower is one thing, but on the modern battlefield in this war of attrition, we also have to talk about equipment, tanks, armored vehicles, artillery. So what's the situation like for the Russian military? In terms of equipment, on the 16th of July 2024, The Economist reported, Russia's vast stocks of Soviet-era weaponry are running out.
Right.
Let's just say the evidence is very flimsy at best. And on the other side, it feels like pure projection. And they also quoted Oryx and reported how Russia lost 3,000 tanks and 5,000 armored vehicles. Oryx is a very interesting tool, but we all know how in 2022, Oryx was really the Wild West. Essentially, any vehicle that had a Z painted on it was by default Russian. I mean, this armored vehicle is obviously Russian. This one as well, no doubt. This BMP 100% belongs to the Russian armed forces. Another flaw is we don't know if some of these armored vehicles and tanks were counted multiple times. More on that later. On a side note, Mediazona reported 932 Russian tank crews as KIA since 2022. I find this very interesting because with a crew of 3 men per tank, that would be equivalent to 300 actual tank losses for Russia. How about we refer to the interview by The Guardian of Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief General Syrskyi. He said since 2022 the number of Russian tanks has doubled from 1,700 to 3,500. Artillery systems have tripled and armored personnel carriers have gone up from 4,500 to 8,900. Despite all the reported losses, Russia still has a net positive in terms of equipment. In this case, attrition is clearly playing in their favor. Because the more armored vehicles the Russians deploy, the more protected their infantry is on the battlefield. According to various sources, Russia had approximately 6,700 BMP-1 and 2,800 BMP-2s in storage as of early 2022, giving a total of 9,500 BMPs. RUSI analysts also state that the Russian defense sector plans to supply 1,500 tanks and 3,000 other armored vehicles in 2024 and 2025, about 80% of which will be restored and modernized vehicles from storage bases. It's the most simple, logical, and cost-effective solution while Russia ramps up its military production. In the end, it's easier to field 10 refurbished and modernized BMP-2s than to produce a brand new BMP-3. Another perk with this procedure is that it produces military equipment and vehicles with which Russian soldiers are already familiar with, that are relatively easy to maintain and can easily be integrated into the existing structure. Overall, unlike what you can hear in the mainstream media, the Russian army is not running out of equipment. Meanwhile, what's the situation like for Ukraine from a material perspective? Long story short, in terms of military equipment, the Ukrainian army is exhausted. We can speculate that the bulk of Ukraine's original arsenal is gone, and they now fully depend on foreign aid. Obviously, we don't have a full breakdown of every brigade, but we do have some snippets. On the 3rd of April 2024, Military Land reported how a lack of vehicles meant that the 153rd Mechanized Brigade is no longer mechanized, and so it became the 153rd Infantry Brigade. It's not the only brigade of the 150 series that is suffering from such a thing. Here from Forbes, Ukraine has run out of modern vehicles for the new brigades it's forming. It's anecdotal, but most of the armored vehicles I see in videos used by the armed forces of Ukraine have been supplied by the West. It's always some sort of Bradley, Mada, or MRAP. For example, out of the confirmed Ukrainian equipment losses during the Kursk offensive, 40% were NATO tanks and IFVs, while the remaining 60% were Soviet-era vehicles. But a lot of these Soviet-era BMPs and BTRs could also be Western deliveries from the former Eastern Bloc like Poland, Czechia, and Bulgaria. That could explain why Ukrainian Defense Minister Umerov said Ukraine is 80% dependent on its partners in terms of armaments and military equipment. In this article by Time from February 2024 titled "The Peril of Ukraine's Ammo Shortage," we read the following. Ukraine fields around 350 artillery pieces, so that in many areas of the front, Ukraine has no artillery at all. Interesting, because in February 2022, Ukraine had roughly 1,000 pieces of 122mm and 152mm artillery. This is what was reported by pro-Ukrainian Radio Free Europe. This means that in 2 years of war, Ukraine lost 65% of its artillery. This is huge! Actually, I think it's even more. US and European weapon deliveries to Ukraine amounted to an extra 500 to 600 artillery pieces, including towed and self-propelled howitzers. So if we put all this together, Ukraine had access to roughly 1,500 howitzers, and now they're down to 350 artillery pieces, meaning the Ukrainian army lost 75% of its artillery. Once again, this is all part of the war of attrition. At this rate, within 10 months, Ukraine will have lost all its artillery. The US and Europe can produce as many artillery shells as they want. Soon enough, Ukraine won't have any howitzers left to fire them, with an average attrition rate of 37 howitzers a month. Even if the UK donated all of its artillery arsenal to Ukraine, it would hardly be enough for half a year. Artillery and everything around it is truly the Achilles heel of Western support to Ukraine. After decades of counterinsurgency wars, barely any NATO military has large stocks of artillery left in storage. Everything has to be built from scratch, and this takes a lot of time. Here from the 10th of September 2024 from the Voice of Ukraine. Ukrainian army reports critical shortage of parts for German PZH-2000 guns. One commander said, "It's a great system, but the wear and tear is very high. PZH-2000s were not made for high-intensity conventional warfare. More weapon systems are out of order due to a lack of spare parts than due to enemy fire." And you want to know the worst? It's nothing new. Already in November 2022, Ukrainian artillerymen complained about this exact thing. Pitfalls in repair for PZH-2000 for Ukraine. One howitzer sacrificed to refit the others. NATO countries are currently scrambling another aid package to Ukraine. In mid-September, Qatar agreed to transfer 12 units of 105mm PZH-2000 self-propelled guns to Germany for subsequent repairs, which will then be delivered to Ukraine. Meaning a net positive of only, 6 howitzers. Le Figaro, France to deliver 6 new Caesar cannons in the coming weeks. Meanwhile, La Dépêche wrote, in January 2024, Defense Minister Sébastien Lecornu promised 78 new deliveries of cannons to Ukraine before the end of the year. 78 Caesar self-propelled howitzers is actually a very good number. France would need to produce 6 times more Caesar self-propelled howitzers just to keep Ukraine afloat. And that's on top of the 49 units already donated to Ukraine, 30 of which came straight from the reserves of the French army. Meanwhile, in February 2024, the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, estimated that the Russian army fielded 5,000 artillery pieces, of which 1,000 self-propelled howitzers, like the 2S1 Gvazdika, 2S3 Akatsiya, 2S5 Gyasint, and 2S7 Pion. If this is true, we're talking about a 14-1 advantage in artillery for Russia. 14-1. This means the Russian armed forces will use their superior firepower to further accelerate the attrition of Ukrainian forces. It's nothing new really. Although the large number of bayonets always played a role in the Russian army, it was always combined with their arme de prédilection, artillery. For example, in 1709 during the Battle of Poltava, where Russian cannons decimated Swedish infantry formations. Once again in 1759 at Kunersdorf, where the Prussians under Frederick the Great experienced firsthand the devastating effects of the Russian artillery. In the end, for the Prussian army, every engagement with the Russians ended in a terrible battle of attrition that was simply unsustainable. Same thing for Napoleon in 1812 during the Battle of Borodino, where Russian artillery caused him so much trouble. At this point, I can hardly imagine a 1-to-1 casualty ratio between Russia and Ukraine. Maybe nowadays we're closer to 1-to-2, 1-to-3, maybe even 1-to-4. Now, as for tanks, according to Military Balance, Ukraine had 858 tanks on day 1 of the war, plus 500 captured Russian tanks they reused. On top of that, we can add Western donations. 800 to 900 MBTs provided, pledged, or on order. Although everyone speaks of the Leopard 2s and M1A1 Abrams, the most useful tanks for Ukraine were the 500 T-72 variants from their allies of the former Eastern Bloc. In the end, a Frankenstein armored corps of 1,800 tanks. The question is, how many of those are still operational today? As of September 2024, Oryx reported 650 Ukrainian tanks destroyed, 47 damaged, and 70 abandoned, as well as 136 captured by the enemy, for a total of about 930 tank losses for Ukraine, nearly 50%. Actual attrition could be much higher if we take into account that many of these tanks were simply cannibalized for spare parts. Here from Business Insider, Ukraine's dwindling supply of Leopard 2 tanks aren't being repaired because Europe doesn't have enough spare parts. The big problem for the armed forces of Ukraine is that very few T-72 variants are left in Eastern Europe. Most of what was in storage has already been donated to Ukraine or used for spare parts. Meanwhile, Ukrainian modernized T-64BM tanks perform well on the battlefield, and they're liked by the troops. But it is unknown how many are still available as replacements. In February 2022, 400 to 500 units were still in storage somewhere in Ukraine. But we can expect most of them to have been dismantled to keep the AFU's current inventory of T-64s up and running. So Ukraine's only real long-term alternative is to get more M1A1 Abrams. As for infantry fighting vehicles or armored personnel carriers, again in most of the videos Ukrainians use NATO vehicles. The only benefit for Ukraine maybe is that its military is slowly starting to get synced with NATO equipment. But even then, attrition is high. For example, Oryx reported the confirmed loss of 103 M2A2 Bradleys. Yet according to Forbes, the US had to send 300 units just to keep Ukraine afloat. Either actual Bradley losses are much higher than what is visually confirmed, or once again a number of these IFVs were simply used for spare parts. The only positive aspect of this is that Ukraine's lack of main battle tanks can be balanced out by M2A2 Bradleys. Those IFVs proved that they can stand their ground against Russian tanks. They can also launch hit-and-run fire missions, and they can also carry infantry straight to enemy trenches. If delivering tanks can become a problem for the West, Bradleys are definitely a good alternative, especially since the US has 2,000 M2 Bradleys in storage. Out of 189 strikers delivered to Ukraine, 22 were destroyed, damaged, or captured. The US military has another 4,500 units in storage. 124 Max Pro MRAPs were destroyed, out of 460 delivered. Yet we can estimate 4,000 of these MRAPs in storage. And this goes pretty much for anything made in the USA. Germany is also helping a lot with its Marder IFVs. Out of 140 units delivered to Ukraine, 33 Marder 1A3s were confirmed as lost. But the Bundeswehr still has approximately 250 units available in storage that they plan to phase out by 2025. Unsurprisingly, France also has an impressive arsenal. The French government delivered 260 VABs to Ukraine, of which only 24 were confirmed as lost. Honestly, it's not too bad. France has committed to delivering several hundred vehicles to Ukraine by 2025. France can afford this because the French army is gradually decommissioning the infamous VAB for the new Scorpion vehicles that you can see on screen. As of 2023, it is estimated that between 2,000 to 3,000 VABs have either been retired or placed in storage, aka available for Ukraine. So in terms of military equipment attrition for Ukraine, artillery, very bad. Tanks, meh. Armored vehicles, okay. The real only bottleneck for Ukraine is to ensure continued US military support. Overall, the US is by far the country that can help Ukraine the most, simply because it has the most military equipment left in storage. While much attention is focused on Western deliveries, it is equally important to maintain, repair, and restore all existing equipment. Attrition is severe since Ukrainian factories stopped producing spare parts for their armored vehicles a long time ago. Most countries in Eastern Europe face similar problems as they phased out their Soviet inventory. In a way, Ukrainian mechanics are one of the reasons Ukraine still managed to fight throughout 2022 and 2023. They managed to make the best out of captured Russian vehicles and trophies. Here we see Ukrainian mechanics trying to rehabilitate a captured Russian BMP-3. However, we can speculate that most of these trophies will be cannibalized to keep the current Ukrainian inventory up and running. In this video by Deutsche Welle, Ukrainian mechanics explain how they cannot repair their damaged howitzers supplied by the West because NATO didn't provide them any spare parts. So they have no other choice but to cannibalize damaged ones for spare parts. They explain how they brought back this howitzer to life at least 6 times. In some cases, the Ukrainians get creative. The guys in the workshops build their own homemade spare parts with civilian material. Another problem that is also overlooked is how most of the heavy repairs for tanks and IVs have to be done in factories located in the European Union, thus adding yet another layer of logistics strain on the Ukrainian military. It's not a bad alternative either. In late July, this entire Ukrainian repair depot with over 20 armored vehicles was spotted and destroyed by a Russian missile strike. Another problem of this rapid Russian advance and all these territorial gains is that now many abandoned Ukrainian armored vehicles find themselves behind the contact line, meaning they cannot be retrieved and repaired. We can also be sure that the Russians will recycle and refurbish all the Ukrainian Soviet-era armored vehicles they get their hands on. And it's also complicated for the ones damaged or abandoned within friendly lines, mostly due to drone and artillery strikes. So in my opinion, this is one of the most severe aspects of this war of attrition for Ukraine. Almost every loss can be considered a write-off. And when they do miraculously manage to bring back a vehicle to a workshop, mechanics struggle due to a catastrophic shortage of spare parts, worsened by the lack of standardization and the wide array of different NATO systems donated to them. On the other side, the situation is completely different. One of the main aspects of Russia's ability to continuously field armored vehicles is through its Rembat, short for Remontny Battalion, or Repair Battalion. The first task is given to engineering units, whose job is to retrieve abandoned armored vehicles using their Brem 1M armored recovery vehicle. After that, mechanics of the Rembat work on the repairs. Each workshop reportedly can return about a dozen combat vehicles to service per day. On the 16th of September, the description of this video stated, "The servicemen did what seemed impossible in frontline conditions. They transplanted a turret from one tank to another, and despite critical damage, they managed to quickly return the combat vehicle to service. No one has ever done such a unique operation to replace a turret on the most modern Russian tank T-90M near the line of contact. In this article, it said that the Russian army built these workshops very close to the front, meaning that vehicles that need some heavy repairs don't have to be shipped back in some remote factory in Siberia anymore. Most of it is done on spot. Sometimes these workshops work on simple maintenance, like welding, replacing an air filter, a barrel, or an engine. It is reported that Rembat specialists also work on the maintenance of large-scale systems, such as the 203mm Malka self-propelled gun, and the entire process can be completed within a few hours only. Another benefit of Russian military equipment is how standardized it is. For example, the Tu-S43 Malva shares the same 152mm Tu-A64 L47 gun as the MSTA SM2 self-propelled howitzer. According to the various articles, a typical repair for a T-80 BVM tank takes 2 to 3 days, and up to 5 days if the damage is heavy. From a logistics perspective, if major repairs are required, a nearby factory becomes a supply point for the necessary spare parts. They actually achieved a logistics miracle by producing the spare parts right on the front. That's why counting the total number of Russian tanks or IVs destroyed is completely idiotic and useless. The same T-80 tank can be counted as destroyed by the Ukrainians multiple times over several months. One interesting info is how Russian repair units claim that they can restore 70% of damaged military equipment back into combat readiness. So as an example, the Ukrainians reported 314 Russian pieces of armor destroyed during the capture of Novomikhailivka. The mainstream media even said Russia wrote off more than 300 vehicles. In reality, we can expect 210 of these armored vehicles to have been repaired and sent right back to the front. Maybe more, who knows? The most important is that they have enough crews to man all these vehicles. In the end, Russia's real strength doesn't necessarily lie in exceptional production, but in its ability to refurbish its massive Soviet-era inventory. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The link is in the description below.